You've heard of the French Revolution, the riots, the mobs, the guillotine. But here's the twist. It wasn't the storming of the Bastille that broke France. It was the storming of its balance sheet. Before heads rolled, numbers collapsed. The guillotines came later. The debt came first. We always picture history as fire and fury, banners, blood, revolutions. But what if it really begins with math, with credit and trust, and the quiet moment they both run out? So here's our roadmap. 4 beats. That's all you need to understand how empires fall. Debt, paper, prices, power shift, simple rhythm, same pattern, over and over again. It happened to France 300 years ago, and it's still happening, just dressed up in modern suits and shiny screens. All right, let's make this personal for a second. Imagine your house runs like France did. You max out your credit card to look successful. You host fancy dinners, upgrade your furniture, maybe even take a vacation you can't afford, just to keep up appearances. When bills start piling up, you borrow from friends. At first it feels fine. Everyone believes you'll pay them back. But one day, they stop lending. That silence, that's what economic collapse sounds like. That's not a king's problem. That's a human one. Every household that spends more than it earns eventually runs into the same wall. It's just that when nations hit that wall, the crash takes millions with them. Now back to France. The 1700s looked golden on the surface. Paris, the art, the culture, the fashion. It was Europe's crown jewel. But underneath that beauty, the numbers were bleeding. The royal treasury was empty. Louis XIV had built Versailles, the grandest palace in Europe, and filled it with marble, gold, and pride. But marble doesn't pay soldiers. Gold leaf doesn't grow food. By the time his heirs took the throne, France wasn't rich anymore. It was drowning in interest payments. Decades of wars, against Britain, against neighbors, even across oceans, had drained the treasury. The 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, each battle left France a little more glorious, and a lot more broke. By 1780, France owed more than 4 billion livres, a number so huge it made repayment impossible. Half the annual budget went just to paying interest. Imagine half your paycheck gone before you even buy food. That's where France stood, shining on the outside, hollow inside. But here's where the story turns from tragedy to farce. The richest people in the country, the nobles and the clergy, paid almost nothing in taxes. The poorest, farmers, merchants, workers, carried everything. The system was rigged top to bottom. Picture this. The baker pays 80% of his income to feed the kingdom, while the duke down the street contributes 0. When reformers tried to fix it, the elite laughed them out of the room. They owned the parliaments. They wrote the laws. And every proposal died the same death, buried under privilege. But debt doesn't wait for politics. It compounds quietly, like mold behind the wallpaper. And by the time you smell it, it's already everywhere. France thought it had time. It didn't. When money stops being fair, when trust stops feeling mutual, the countdown starts. The poor paid everything. And the people who carried the weight, they would soon carry torches. Every empire thinks it's different, smarter, stronger, too civilized to fail. But they all learn the same lesson. When food prices rise faster than wages, revolutions begin. It never starts with speeches or slogans. It starts with the price of bread. By the late 1780s, French families weren't arguing about politics. They were arguing about dinner. Grain harvest had failed after a brutal winter. Bread, the center of every meal, suddenly cost 3 times more than the year before. The average worker spent half his income just trying to eat. When that half turned into 2/3, survival became math. And when math stops adding up, faith collapses next. You can hear it in the streets of Paris, the sound of coins clinking, the mutter of worry, the scrape of empty ovens. Markets were open, but no one could afford to buy. The rich threw feasts, their tables glowing with silver and wine, while outside the gates, mothers waited in lines that never moved. A mother counts her paper money. The baker shakes his head. "Bread costs triple this week," he says. She looks at the bills again, as if maybe she miscounted, as if the paper could somehow stretch itself. Her son tugs her sleeve, hungry, The baker shrugs, not cruelly, just tired. He can't sell for less than what it costs him to bake. The mother walks away empty-handed, her pocket full of paper, her stomach full of fear. That's the real face of inflation. It isn't an economic term. It's the slow theft of certainty. Prices rise, paychecks don't, and trust in everything, government, markets, even your own savings, starts to crack. And so France reached for what every desperate government does when the math stops working. It printed. They called it the assignat, a new kind of money backed by land seized from the church. On paper, it looked brilliant. Turn property into liquidity, issue notes that represent value, sell the land, and use the money to pay off the debt. Problem solved. At first it actually worked. People accepted the notes. Trade resumed, shops reopened, farmers sold grain again. The wheels of commerce began to turn. It felt like magic, the economy reborn with ink instead of gold. But paper is a dangerous drug. Once it works, it's hard to stop using. The government found itself printing more to pay every new expense. Soldiers, pensions, bread subsidies, everything. The link between paper and land stretched thinner with every note. Before long, those crisp bills weren't backed by fields or farms anymore. They were backed by promises, promises built on promises. They turned land into paper, then paper into promises. That works until it doesn't. As more money flooded the streets, something invisible began to change. People started watching not what money said, but what it did. They noticed the coins disappearing from circulation. Merchants hoarded silver. Farmers refused to sell grain for paper. And for the first time, the public started tracking something no king had ever feared before: trust. Imagine a giant gauge hovering above the nation, a trust meter. At the start, the needle sits high, green, and calm. Every time the government prints more, the needle dips slightly. When it fixes prices by law, it drops again. When bakers are punished for charging too much, it slides toward red. And then one day the needle hits bottom. The bread lines turn into protests. The protests turn into mobs, and the streets go loud. When trust is lost, no decree can bring it back. You can order a man to bake. You can't order him to believe. By 1793, France was drowning in its own paper. Over 8 billion livres worth of assignats flooded the economy. Prices exploded. Bread that once cost 4 sous now cost 12. Shoes that once cost a week's pay now cost a month's. Savings vanished overnight. For the first time, money itself became an enemy. People burned it for warmth. Merchants demanded payment in gold or in anything real: grain, cloth, metal, even labor. Barter replaced currency. Trust, the glue that held markets together, had disintegrated. And when people lose faith in paper, they turn to power. The revolution that began with ideals had mutated into something else: a fight for survival. The National Convention tried to stop the bleeding. They passed laws fixing prices, banning hoarding, declaring economic enemies of the people. But policy can't override scarcity. You can't legislate trust, so they turned to fear. Bakers accused of raising prices were dragged before tribunals. Some were executed. The guillotine, once reserved for tyrants, now served as price control. When money dies, trust dies first. And when trust dies, peace follows. You can feel the panic build. People running, shouting, clutching worthless notes. Shopkeepers closing doors. Soldiers demanding pay in metal, not paper. The city of light flickering under the weight of its own false promises. Every sound is sharper, every breath faster. In the distance, the printing presses still hum, spitting out more notes no one wants. Each sheet adds heat to the fire. Each promise fuels the rage. And here's the irony. The revolution that overthrew a king for fiscal mismanagement was now repeating his mistakes, just with better slogans. The old order printed indulgence, the new one printed salvation. Both forgot the same rule: trust doesn't print twice. By now, France wasn't a country managing an economy. It was an economy managing chaos. The trust meter sits deep in the red. The streets are louder than the speeches. And what began as reform has turned into survival. Bread, money, power. 3 simple needs, tied together by one fragile thing. Not gold, not law, trust. And once that's gone, the storm doesn't need kings to begin. It just needs hunger. Power doesn't vanish when systems collapse. It just changes hands. In France, it moved like a current, invisible but unstoppable. From the king's gold desk, to the parliament's papers, to the committee's decrees, and finally to the hands of a soldier holding a sword. Who holds the pen controls the panic. At first it was the monarch. His signature still carried weight, even when the treasury was empty. Then it was the parliaments, noblemen, and clergy, arguing about taxes they would never pay. Then came the revolutionaries, promising liberty, equality, and bread, but drowning their ideals under piles of freshly printed money. Every new government believed it could control the storm as long as it could print fast enough. But the presses didn't print salvation, they printed confusion. And when a nation starts printing faster than it can think, the ink always runs ahead of reason. By 1793, France wasn't run by kings anymore. It was run by committees, by signatures, by decrees, by endless sheets of paper that promised everything and delivered nothing. People didn't need to understand policy, they could feel it. The money in their hands was getting lighter, cheaper, emptier. The more the leaders spoke of control, the more people felt the chaos underneath. And then, amid that exhaustion, a pattern appeared. Every failed government left behind a stronger one. Every collapse made people hungrier for order, even if it came with iron. That's when Napoleon arrived. He didn't come with speeches about freedom. He came with numbers that worked. He built banks before he built armies. He restored credit before he sought glory. Because he understood something simple. Numbers obey discipline, not dreams. He turned the Bank of France into a machine of stability, part state, part private, designed not to inspire people but to control them. The revolution had given France ideas. Napoleon gave it order. Because when a nation loses faith in words, it starts to worship balance sheets again. That's the cycle. The crown falls. The mob rises. The banker returns. The script never changes. Only the actors do. But let's leave the palaces for a moment and step into the streets where trust actually lives. A cobbler stands behind his stall, boots neatly lined on a rough wooden table. He's not selling anymore, he's trading. "A pair of boots for 2 loaves," he says. "If the bread's fresh, make it 3. He smiles like it's a joke, but it's not. He's forgotten the sound of coins. A factory worker clutches his pay envelope. A week's wages printed on fragile paper. He holds it up to the light, half expecting it to fade. "I got paid today," he mutters, "and it's already worth less." He doesn't even sound angry, just numb. And that mother, the one who walked away from the bakery, she's still there. This time she's holding her child's hand, staring at the crowd chanting slogans about freedom. She whispers to No, one in particular, "We wanted freedom. We got prices." Those are not speeches. Those are the diary entries of collapse. That's what happens when money stops being a promise and becomes a problem. It turns citizens into accountants of their own survival. They count loaves, count bills, count the days until tomorrow costs more than today. Economic trust, that invisible glue holding a society together, had cracked. Once it breaks, it doesn't repair like roads or walls. It decays quietly, transaction by transaction. It's not inflation you feel first. It's hesitation. The pause before a handshake. The double check before a deal. The sense that maybe the paper won't hold its worth another week. Markets slowed. Merchants started hoarding. Farmers stopped selling grain for money that lost value before the wagon reached home. People didn't say it out loud, but they all knew something sacred was gone. The government could print all it wanted. The people had stopped believing, and disbelief spreads faster than ink. When a state loses control of money, it loses control of mood. You can see it in the streets, the shouting, the silence, the fear that feels like background noise. Even the printing presses sound different, their rhythmic clatter turning into a pulse of anxiety. The government thought it was creating liquidity. What it created was paranoia. The deeper truth is this. Money is never just metal or paper. It's a shared story, a collective agreement about what matters. And when that story fractures, the collapse isn't financial, it's psychological. People stop working not because they're lazy, but because work no longer converts to stability. Why build? Why save? Why plan? When tomorrow can erase today's effort. That's the unspoken heart of every crisis. Fatigue. Not just hunger or anger, but the exhaustion of pretending things still make sense. A nation doesn't fall in one day. It falls one disbelieving citizen at a time. Now look closer. Doesn't that sound familiar? If your grocery bill grows faster than your paycheck, you're living the same math. When the rate on your mortgage or credit card jumps, when your rent goes up but your raise doesn't, that quiet unease you feel, that's 1793 translated into your wallet. When borrowing starts to feel like quicksand, every payment pulling you deeper, you're not just managing debt, you're reliving history. We like to think the world has evolved past these cycles, but inflation, debt, and distrust still move like old ghosts. They haunt supermarkets instead of bakeries and credit markets instead of royal treasuries, but the rhythm is unchanged. First slowly, then suddenly. Money doesn't fail in one day. It leaks, then it breaks. It starts small, a few extra dollars for groceries, a bill that's a little higher than last month. Then one morning you realize your paycheck buys less, your savings feel thinner, your future feels closer. That's not coincidence. That's the silent arithmetic of trust leaking away. And when trust leaks, everything follows. Markets stall, people pull back, confidence drains. The same fear that turned Paris into a furnace in 1793 still hums beneath modern cities. Invisible but alive. You can feel it in rising prices, in late-night news cycles, in quiet conversations about what if. Trust leaks before it breaks. Always. That's why revolutions never start with fury. They start with disbelief, not in governments or kings, but in the basic promise that effort equals reward. When that belief dies, no slogan can save it. No speech can legislate faith. And when enough people stop believing at the same time, the whole system tilts. The numbers stop adding up. The stories stop matching reality. And that's when power shifts again, from kings to committees to generals, and now to central banks, algorithms, and policies most people never read but still live by. The modern pen doesn't write with ink. It writes with interest rates. It doesn't sign decrees. It sets digits. But it still holds the same authority, the power to calm a crowd or light a fuse. So maybe nothing has changed after all. We're still ruled by whoever manages belief. We still trust the story printed on the paper in our wallets, until one day we don't. So ask yourself right now, wherever you're watching from, what's rising faster where you live, prices or pay? Because that question isn't just about economics, it's about gravity. Every time the cost of living outruns the value of work, the floor tilts a little. And history, quietly, starts to rhyme again. Maybe that's the real legacy of France. Not liberty or equality or fraternity, but a reminder whispered across centuries. No empire, no currency, no era is safe once trust begins to leak. The moment people stop believing the paper will hold, the countdown starts. And when it ends, the pen moves again, into new hands, writing the same old story, one more time. When a system breaks, people look for theories. But what they really need is a playbook. Something simple, something real. Because collapse isn't just a story from the past, it's a rhythm that still hums beneath our lives today. The question is never if it happens again. It's how ready you are when it does. So here's your survival playbook. 5 simple rules that have kept people steady through every storm. From 1793 to right now. No fancy charts, no jargon. Just common sense dressed in discipline. First, track your basics. Rent, food, fuel, the essentials. Most people track the wrong numbers. Likes, followers, opinions. But survival isn't about how smart you sound. It's about how stable you are. Know exactly how much you need to live 1 month without panic. Write it down. That's your true foundation. Everything else is noise. Second, cut fancy debt first. The kind that flatters you while it quietly handcuffs your future. The second car you barely drive. The subscription that buys convenience but drains freedom. The clothes that say success while whispering stress. France printed paper to look rich. Don't repeat that mistake with plastic. Debt isn't evil, it's leverage. But the wrong kind of leverage turns blessings into pressure, and pressure into collapse. Third, build a boring buffer. 3 to 6 months of expenses, sitting quietly in the background. Not in crypto, not in collectibles, not in some app you barely understand. Just simple, boring, liquid cash. People roll their eyes at that, until the lights flicker. In every crisis, the ones who make it through aren't the smartest or the loudest. They're the ones who built a boring cushion before everyone else realized they should have. Boring is the new brave. Fourth, income beats opinions. We live in a world that worships commentary more than contribution. Everyone has a take, few have receipts, but when the current shifts, cash flow is what keeps you afloat. Learn a trade, Pick up a side gig, sell a skill, anything that keeps value moving toward you instead of away. Talkers trend, builders endure. And fifth, don't keep all your faith in one number. Not your paycheck, not your stock portfolio, not your government's promises. Every empire, every system, every currency that ever collapsed had one thing in common. Everyone believed it was too solid to fall. Spread your trust the way you spread your investments. A little in savings, a little in skills, a little in community. The strongest structure isn't the tallest. It's the one with multiple supports. That's the playbook. 5 moves that turn awareness into armor. Track your basics. Cut fancy debt first. Build a boring buffer. Income beats opinions. Don't keep all faith in one number. It's not glamorous, but neither is survival. You can pass a rule. You can't pass belief. That's the lesson every era learns the hard way. You can legislate prices, freeze wages, print decrees, but you can't force trust. The moment people stop believing the story ends. And when belief dies, no government, no system, no revolution can bring it back. That's why this isn't just a documentary about France. It's a mirror. Because what happened in 1793 wasn't unique. It was universal. The collapse of trust, the inflation of hope, the quiet arithmetic that always comes for the careless. Next, we cross the ocean. America's version of the same story. The moment it saw the cliff and somehow dodged it, but not without a price. The next episode, America's detour. How a young nation outsmarted the math and what it traded for it. So before we go, tell me your city. What's rising faster where you live? Prices or pay? Because I'm mapping how trust travels in real time. And if you want the next playbook, subscribe. No spam, just signal. Because history isn't a warning, it's a pattern. And the sooner you learn to read it, the sooner you stop being its victim. Every empire prints its promises. Every citizen decides what they're worth. The question is, when the next cycle starts, will you be ready or just surprised?